Well, crude oil is on the rise after Saudi Arabia says it will slash oil production by 1 million barrels per day starting in July.
Inflation is rising in Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman launched Vision 2030. All does not seem well with that project.
In May 2025, Saudi Arabia's economic challenges intensified as oil prices fell to around $60 per barrel, significantly below the $110 per barrel needed to balance its budget. According to Goldman Sachs, this decline has exacerbated the kingdom's fiscal deficit, projected to reach $64 billion or about 11% of its GDP. Is Saudi Arabia collapsing? Could this be the end of Saudi Arabia's wealth? Despite these economic strains, Saudi Arabian officials announced a $600 billion investment commitment during a high-profile meeting with US President Donald Trump to project strength and attract foreign investment. However, beneath these grand announcements, the kingdom faces mounting economic pressures that threaten its long-term stability. And it could be closer than you think. But how did they get to this point? This month, US President Donald Trump visited Saudi Arabia, where he and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman announced a $600 billion investment commitment, including a $142 billion arms deal regarded as one of the largest in history. The agreement spans sectors like energy, defense, technology, and infrastructure, with notable deals involving US tech giants such as Nvidia and AMD supplying AI semiconductors to Saudi Arabia's new AI firm, Humane. While these deals were presented as transformative, many lacked detailed implementation plans, and some mirrored previous unfulfilled promises. The grandeur of the announcements contrasted sharply with the kingdom's underlying economic challenges, including a growing fiscal deficit and over-reliance on oil revenues. The spectacle aimed to project an image of financial strength and modernisation, yet it masked the pressing need for structural reforms and diversification within Saudi Arabia's economy. For decades, Saudi Arabia's economic powers rested entirely on a single source: oil, a black commodity that granted the kingdom unmatched global influence throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries. But today, this once unshakable foundation is starting to crack. The kingdom remains dangerously dependent on crude oil, which still accounts for 90% of export earnings, 80% of government income, and 45% of the country's GDP, according to data from the Saudi Ministry of Finance. This extreme reliance has made the entire system extraordinarily vulnerable to fluctuations in the global energy market, and this year has brought some of the most painful swings yet. After years of struggling to keep oil prices high, Saudi Arabia now faces an uncomfortable truth. The IMF calculates it needs about $90 per barrel to fund its national budget. However, since the Liberation Day event earlier this year, global demand expectations have continued to go down, and oil prices have tumbled to around $60 per barrel, nearly half of what Riyadh needs just to stay afloat. This massive price gap is not just a temporary headache, but a blow to the kingdom's financial stability. According to Saudi Arabia's National Debt Management Center report, the government would need to borrow a staggering $37 billion to finance its development goals for this year. Even worse, these numbers may not really capture the depth of the crisis. The kingdom still holds substantial foreign exchange reserves estimated at around $410 billion as of January, but those reserves are steadily shrinking. Much of that reserve is used to defend the rial's peg to the US dollar. Any depletion in reserves could risk a currency devaluation, which would be an unthinkable scenario for a nation whose imports and government programs remain dollar dependent. Meanwhile, efforts to stabilise oil markets through OPEC production cuts have repeatedly run into resistance, even as members like Iraq, Kazakhstan and the UAE quietly exceeded their quotas. Angola officially left the cartel in late 2024, citing disagreements with most of Saudi-imposed policies. This division inside OPEC leaves Saudi Arabia with fewer tools to control global oil prices, especially when large producers outside the group, such as the United States, Brazil, and Guyana, continue to ramp up output. Saudi Arabia has also tried to respond by unilaterally slashing its production by 2 million barrels daily to support prices, but that only reduces its revenues further. Now, even with lower output, the price floor won't hold. This is a tacit admission that the dream of keeping oil above $100 per barrel has failed. Yet the most perilous aspect of Saudi Arabia's crisis isn't just the numbers, it's the illusion of wealth. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman persists in showcasing grand projects and global deals as though the kingdom remains flush with cash. But beneath this public image of prosperity, Saudi Arabia may be running on borrowed time and maybe borrowed money. The true danger lies in what comes next for the kingdom. Vision 2030, the Crown Prince's flagship plan to liberate Saudi Arabia from oil dependence, may be forced to scale back, not because of any strategic reconsideration, but simply because it cannot afford it. In other words, what started as a bold plan to escape oil dependency may now suffocate under the same oil crisis it was meant to solve. Back to Vision 2030, the Crown Prince announced, what exactly is Vision 2030 and why might it slow the country's path to wealth? When Vision 2030 was announced in April 2016, it was sold to the world as the blueprint for Saudi Arabia's transformation, a leap from black gold to digital dynamism, from oil rigs to technological labs, from rigid monarchy to modern economy. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman wasn't just unveiling an economic policy at the time, he was on a mission to rebrand his kingdom. The message was bold: the future no longer runs on oil, but on ambition. However, nearly a decade later, that ambition is bleeding too much cash, crumbling under its own weight, and increasingly looking like a vision blurred by fantasy. At the heart of Vision 2030 lies NEOM. This flagship megacity project promised a $500 billion, 170km long futuristic city that was stretched through the desert, powered by renewable energy, and was meant to symbolise Saudi Arabia's quantum leap into the future. Instead, it's become a monument to unfulfilled promises. As of this year, just a small fraction of the NEOM line has been constructed. Satellite imagery reveals mostly untouched desert, and the world still sees much of the dunes and stalled cranes, where sleek towers and futuristic spires were promised. Deadlines have continued to be pushed back, with the latest completion of the full 170km of the line expected to be in 2045. In recent months, sources close to the project have admitted that only 2% of the original city plan has reached any meaningful level of development. The cracks in Vision 2030 go far beyond construction delays. The real blow comes from some investors who are pulling out. Foreign capital, which is one of the essential lifelines of Vision 2030, has slowed to a trickle as some of the kingdom's most hyped investment summits failed to convert global interest into hard commitments. And it's not just NEOM. Other mega projects such as the Qiddiya Entertainment City and the Red Sea Tourism Initiative have either been scaled back or delayed. Many futuristic renderings remain just that, digital dreams projected onto global screens. Even with Saudi Arabia, the plan's contradictions are becoming impossible to ignore. One of Vision 2030's most touted goals is to build a thriving private sector that would account for more than half of GDP. But here's the catch: most of the private sector growth has heavily depended on the same government contracts. In other words, it's not state-private, but state-funded capitalism in disguise. Meanwhile, small and medium-sized enterprises, the backbone of any healthy private economy, are struggling under administrative limitations, scarce financing, and a labour market that prioritises public employment. The employment crisis exposes another flaw. Vision 2030 was meant to create millions of private sector jobs for Saudis, especially the youth. However, despite flashy announcements of new opportunities, most Saudi nationals still overwhelmingly prefer public sector employment, where pay is better and job security is guaranteed. The kingdom's Saudiization policy, which mandates private firms to hire locals, has created more friction than results. Even as the government pours billions into incentives, subsidies, and support programs, the outcomes remain largely underwhelming. It's no longer just about failing to meet goals, it's about failing to inspire trust. The most telling thing is the silence around revised targets. Original benchmarks like having non-oil exports account for 50% of total exports or getting 10% of GDP from tourism by 2030 are now quietly and slowly becoming absent from public updates. The transparency that once made Vision 2030 a beacon of reform is giving way to vague updates and media-managed messaging. So what happens when a vision this massive eventually loses momentum? For a country that has tied its identity and international image to this transformation, the implications go far beyond economics. A lot more is involved. Let's take a look at Saudi Arabia's population. If the foundation of any strong economy is its people, then Saudi Arabia has a serious fault line running straight through its future. The kingdom has one of the youngest populations in the world. According to Saudi Arabia's ambassador to the US, around 70% of Saudis are under 35. That sounds like an advantage because a youthful population should mean energy, innovation, and growth. But in Saudi Arabia today, it increasingly means restlessness, disillusionment, and possible economic stagnation. One of the most persistent challenges is youth unemployment. In 2024, Saudi youth unemployment hovered around 13%, and for young women, it's even worse. Despite government programs aimed at integrating more women into the workforce, hiring in both the private and public sectors remains sluggish. And even when jobs are available in private firms and with better pay, they often offer less job security in the long run. The disappointment is real for many Saudi graduates, especially those trained abroad or in elite domestic institutions. They return to a job market that doesn't reward skills, offers little room for growth, and relies heavily on connections rather than competence. The public sector, which is already overstretched and under strain, can't absorb everyone, and the private sector burdened by Vision 2030's expectations, hasn't evolved fast enough to pick up the slack. What happens when ambition meets a wall of economic reality? Many young Saudis are choosing to wait, postponing marriage, delaying home ownership, and withdrawing from traditional milestones of adulthood. That wait has been breeding frustration lately. Meanwhile, debt is creeping into more households. The government itself is borrowing from the West at record levels to fund mega projects and plug budget gaps. But so are ordinary Saudis. Personal loans are rising and consumer debt is becoming more common, especially among the middle class. Add to that a housing market where affordability is slipping away. Real estate prices in cities like Riyadh and Jeddah have climbed sharply, driven in part by speculative building around Vision 2030 projects. For many young families, owning a fully bought home now feels more like a dream than a destination. What makes this more dangerous is that there's no obvious outlet for this frustration. Public protests are rarely carried out in the kingdom and are awfully swiftly shut down, even as social media remains heavily monitored. Every economic empire gives subtle warnings before it falls, and Saudi Arabia might be no different. On the surface, the kingdom still flexes its strength with lavish summits, royal decrees, international partnerships, and the occasional ribbon cutting for futuristic projects. However, beneath the glossy facade is a slow-motion unravelling that no one wants to acknowledge out loud. Let's start with one of the biggest cracks, the kingdom's foreign reserves. For decades, Saudi Arabia's towering oil revenues helped it build one of the world's largest financial cushions. At its peak in 2014, the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority reported its foreign reserves to be over $730 billion. That was enough to survive any economic shock. But by the beginning of this year, those reserves have dipped well below $410 billion, and the bleeding hasn't stopped. Why does this matter? Foreign reserves allow countries like Saudi Arabia to defend their currency peg against the US dollar. The rial has been pegged at 3.75 per dollar since 1986. With every drop in oil revenue and every new round of borrowing, the cost of maintaining that peg gets harder. A break in that peg, even slightly, could trigger inflation, capital flight, and a loss of public confidence that would be nearly impossible to reverse. And then there's geopolitical fragility, which Saudi Arabia once seemed immune to. Historically, the kingdom has been protected by its oil because the West needs it, the East respects it, and its immediate neighbours fear its influence. But that cushion is getting thinner by the day. United States and Saudi relations have become more transactional and less dependable, especially as Trump seems to be moving towards energy independence and domestic priorities. So what does this mean for the kingdom's future? It means that collapse may not come with a bang, such as a financial crash or regime overthrow. However, it's more likely to look like a gradual delay in wages, slower infrastructure rollouts, downgraded bond ratings, shrinking global clout, quiet decisions to postpone mega projects indefinitely, or a soft but steady tightening of capital controls. The greatest danger lies in how easily this crisis could be overlooked. The world might miss it until it's too late, because Saudi Arabia isn't Venezuela. It's not a war-torn country. It still moves oil, still projects stability, still commands geopolitical weight, but if the Rial's dollar peg falters, if reserves fall below critical thresholds, or if another global event wipes out oil demand again, the effect might be disastrous. And by the time it's visible on the surface, much of the damage will already be done behind closed palace doors. Thanks for watching, please ensure you like, share and subscribe for more. Also, drop your thoughts in the comments, we want to hear from you. See you in the next video.